The dust had barely settled on Margaret's husband's grave when the bank foreclosed on everything she had left, and at 43 years old, she found herself standing in the middle of a dirt road in Tucson, Arizona territory, with nothing but a worn carpetbag and a heart full of despair. The year was 1882, and the Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on her black mourning dress as she watched the last of her possessions being loaded onto a wagon by men who wouldn't meet her eyes. Thomas had died 6 months ago from pneumonia, leaving behind debts she never knew existed. The ranch they had built together over 15 years of marriage was gone. The cattle, the horses, the furniture her mother had given them as a wedding gift, all of it sold to pay creditors who showed up like vultures the moment Thomas took his last breath. Margaret walked slowly down the main street of Tucson, her boots kicking up small clouds of red dust with each step. The town was bustling with activity. Cowboys rode past on their horses, their spurs jingling. Women in their finest dresses walked along the wooden sidewalks, parasols shading them from the brutal sun. Somewhere a piano played, and the sound of laughter drifted from one of the many saloons that lined the street. She had nowhere to go. Her parents were long dead, buried back in Missouri. Thomas had been an only child, and his parents had passed before they married. She had no siblings, no cousins she kept in touch with, no friends close enough to impose upon in such dire circumstances. The few women she had known socially had disappeared the moment her financial situation became known. Poverty was contagious in their eyes. Margaret stopped in front of the Silver Star Hotel and stared at her reflection in the window. The woman looking back at her seemed ancient. Lines creased her forehead and bracketed her mouth. Gray streaked through her dark brown hair, which she wore pulled back in a severe bun. Her dress, though clean, was faded and patched in places. She looked exactly like what she was, a widow past her prime with nothing to offer the world. "I'm too old to start over again," she sighed wearily, her breath fogging the glass slightly. A shadow fell across her reflection, and she turned to find a man standing beside her. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a lean build that spoke of years of hard work. He wore dusty clothes, typical cowboy attire, a worn shirt, leather vest, denim pants, and scuffed boots with spurs. A hat shadowed his face, but she could see a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble and eyes that were a striking shade of blue-green. He looked to be somewhere in his late 40s, perhaps 50, with sun-weathered skin and lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often. "We're never too old to be happy," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried a hint of Texas in the drawl. Margaret blinked at him, startled by the intimacy of his statement. "I beg your pardon. Sorry, ma'am. Didn't mean to startle you or speak out of turn. Name's Jacob Brennan. I couldn't help but overhear what you said, and I felt compelled to respond. Sometimes when a person's at their lowest, they need to hear that things can get better." He touched the brim of his hat politely. "Mrs. Margaret Hollies," she replied automatically, then wondered why she was introducing herself to a stranger on the street. Perhaps because he was the first person in weeks who had spoken to her with kindness rather than pity or judgment. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Mrs. Hollies." Jacob's eyes were kind, and there was something genuine in his expression that made Margaret's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Are you waiting for someone? You look a bit lost, if you don't mind my saying," Margaret laughed, but it came out bitter. "Lost is an excellent way to describe my current situation, Mr. Brennan. I'm not waiting for anyone because there's no one left to wait for." Jacob studied her for a long moment, and Margaret had the unsettling feeling that he could see right through her brave facade to the terrified woman underneath. "Have you eaten today, ma'am?" The question caught her off guard. She tried to remember when she had last had a proper meal and realized it had been the day before yesterday. "That's none of your concern, Mr. Brennan." "Maybe not, but I was just about to head over to the restaurant across the street for some dinner, and it seems a shame to eat alone when there's a lady who looks like she could use a hot meal and maybe some friendly conversation." No strings attached, Mrs. Hollies. Just one human being helping another. Margaret knew she should refuse. It wasn't proper for a widow to dine with a strange man, especially so soon after her husband's death. But propriety had fled along with her home and her security, and the gnawing emptiness in her stomach was making her light-headed. Besides, what did she have left to lose? All right, Mr. Brennan, thank you. The restaurant was small but clean, with checkered tablecloths and the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread filling the air. Jacob led her to a table near the window and held out her chair with the manners of a gentleman, which surprised her. Many cowboys she had encountered over the years were rough around the edges, but Jacob Brennan seemed different when the waitress came. Jacob ordered for both of them, beef stew with fresh bread, coffee, and apple pie. Margaret started to protest that it was too much, but he waved her objection away with a smile. A person needs sustenance, especially during difficult times, he said simply. As they waited for the food, Jacob leaned back in his chair and regarded her with those perceptive eyes. I'm guessing by your earlier statement that you're facing some kind of crossroads, Mrs. Hollies. If you want to talk about it, I'm a good listener. If you'd rather not, that's fine too. We can discuss the weather or the price of cattle or anything else that strikes your fancy. Something about his easy manner and obvious sincerity made Margaret's carefully constructed walls crumble. Before she knew it, she was telling him everything. About Thomas and their years together, about his death and the debts, about losing the ranch that very morning. The words poured out of her like water from a broken dam, and Jacob listened without interrupting, his expression sympathetic but not pitying. When she finally ran out of words, the food had arrived, and Margaret was surprised to find tears streaming down her face. She dabbed at them hastily with her napkin, embarrassed by the display of emotion. I apologize, Mr. Brennan. I don't know what came over me. You must think me a foolish woman. I think you're a woman who has been through hell and is doing her best to survive, Jacob said quietly. There's no shame in that, Mrs. Hollies, and there's certainly no shame in grieving what you've lost. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. The stew was delicious, rich and hearty, and Margaret felt strength returning to her body with each bite. Finally, Jacob set down his spoon and looked at her seriously. I have a proposition for you, Mrs. Hollies, and I want you to hear me out before you say no. Margaret's guard went up immediately. She had heard about propositions from strange men, and none of them were respectable. Mr. Brennan, I appreciate the meal, but I'm not that kind of woman. Jacob's eyes widened, and then he laughed, a warm sound that made several other diners turn to look. Lord, no, ma'am. I apologize if I gave you that impression. What I'm proposing is entirely respectable, I assure you. Then what are you proposing? I own a ranch about 20 miles north of here. It's a good-sized spread with about 200 head of cattle and some horses. I've been running it on my own for the past 3 years since my wife passed, but I'm getting older and the work is getting harder. I need help, Mrs. Hollies. I need someone who knows ranch life, someone who can cook and keep house and help with the day-to-day operations. I'm not proposing marriage or anything improper. I'm offering you a job, room, and board plus a fair wage. You'd have your own quarters, complete privacy, and the respect due to any employee. Margaret stared at him, her mind reeling. You don't even know me, Mr. Brennan. Why would you offer such a thing to a complete stranger? Because I've been where you are, Jacob said, his voice taking on a rough edge. 3 years ago, when my Sarah died, I felt like my world had ended. We never had children, and without her, the ranch felt empty and meaningless. I was ready to sell it all and drink myself to death in some saloon. But a friend of mine, an old cowboy named Pete, he told me the same thing I told you today. We're never too old to be happy. We're never too old to start fresh and find purpose again. He helped me through that dark time, and I learned that sometimes the best way to heal yourself is to help someone else. Margaret's throat tightened again. She could hear the sincerity in his words, the pain of loss that echoed her own. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it. I'm staying at the Silver Star Hotel tonight and heading back to the ranch tomorrow morning. If you decide you want to take me up on the offer, meet me at the livery stable at dawn. If you don't show up, I'll understand and wish you well." Jacob pulled out some coins and left them on the table to pay for the meal. "Either way, Mrs. Hollis, please remember what I said. You're not too old to start over. None of us are, not as long as we're still breathing." He stood and tipped his hat to her, then walked out of the restaurant, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts and the remainder of her apple pie. That night, Margaret lay in a lumpy bed in the cheapest boarding house she could find, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Jacob Brennan's offer. Every practical bone in her body told her it was madness to go off to some remote ranch with a man she had just met. He could be lying about everything. He could have nefarious intentions despite his claims of respectability. But what other choice did she have? She had exactly $3.50 to her name. That would last her perhaps another week if she was extremely frugal. She had no skills beyond ranching and keeping house, and no references since her entire life had been tied up in her marriage to Thomas. She could try to find work in town, but jobs for women her age were scarce and usually involved backbreaking labor for pennies. More than the practical considerations, though, something about Jacob Brennan had resonated with her. The kindness in his eyes, the understanding in his voice, the shared experience of loss and grief. He had looked at her and seen a person, not a burden or an object of pity. That alone was worth taking a chance on. As the first light of dawn crept through the thin curtains, Margaret made her decision. She washed her face in the basin, pinned up her hair, and gathered her few belongings. Then she walked through the quiet streets of Tucson to the livery stable. Jacob was there, saddling a large bay horse. When he saw her, his face broke into a smile that transformed his features, making him look years younger. "Mrs. Hollis, I'm real glad to see you. I'm probably making a terrible mistake, Mr. Brennan, but I accept your offer. You won't regret it, ma'am, I promise you that." He gestured to a smaller chestnut mare tied nearby. "I took the liberty of hoping you'd come, so I arranged for a horse for you. Are you comfortable riding?" "I grew up on a ranch, Mr. Brennan. I've been riding since before I could walk." The smile grew wider. "I had a feeling about you, Mrs. Hollis. I had a feeling you were tougher than you looked." They rode out of Tucson as the sun rose, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and orange. The terrain was harsh but beautiful. All saguaro cacti and scrub brush and red rock formations that jutted up from the earth like ancient sentinels. Jacob rode with the easy grace of a man who had spent his life in the saddle, and Margaret found herself relaxing despite her nervousness about the situation. They talked as they rode, sharing stories about their lives. Jacob told her about growing up in Texas, the youngest of 5 brothers. His father had been a rancher, and Jacob had learned the trade from childhood. He had met his wife Sarah at a church social when he was 25, and they had married within 6 months. They had moved to Arizona Territory shortly after, looking for new opportunities and cheaper land. "Sarah couldn't have children," Jacob said, his voice distant with memory. "We tried for years, saw doctors, prayed about it. Eventually we accepted that it just wasn't meant to be. She threw herself into the ranch, into making our home beautiful, into helping the community. She was the strongest woman I ever knew, and when the fever took her 3 years ago, I didn't think I could go on." Margaret shared her own story in return. She had met Thomas when she was 26, already considered on the shelf by most standards. He had been a widower with no children, 10 years her senior, looking for a practical wife rather than a romantic love match. Their marriage had been built on mutual respect and companionship rather than passion, but it had been comfortable and solid. Or so she had thought until she discovered the debts. "I'm angry at him," she admitted, surprising herself with the confession. "I know I shouldn't speak ill of the dead, but I'm so angry that he left me in this position. That he made decisions without telling me, took out loans I knew nothing about. We were supposed to be partners, but he treated me like a child who couldn't handle the truth." "That's understandable," Jacob said. You're allowed to be angry, Mrs. Hollies. Love and anger can exist side by side. It doesn't mean you didn't care for him. The ranch appeared in the distance around midday, a collection of buildings nestled in a valley between two ridges of hills. As they drew closer, Margaret could see a main house, a barn, a bunkhouse, and several smaller outbuildings. Cattle grazed in the distance, and a few horses ran in a corral near the barn. "It's beautiful," she said, meaning it. "It's home," Jacob replied simply. He showed her around the property, introducing her to his two ranch hands, a weathered old cowboy named Charlie and a younger man named Miguel who couldn't have been more than 25. Both men tipped their hats respectfully when Jacob explained that Mrs. Hollies would be helping with the household and ranch operations. The main house was larger than Margaret had expected, with a spacious kitchen, a dining room, a sitting room, and 3 bedrooms. Everything was clean but Spartan, clearly the domain of men who cared little for decoration or comfort beyond the basic necessities. "This was Sarah's domain," Jacob said, showing her the largest bedroom. "It hasn't been used since she passed. I've been sleeping in the smaller room because I couldn't bear to use this one. But I want you to have it, Mrs. Hollies. You'll need the space and the privacy." The room was indeed spacious, with a large bed covered in a wedding ring quilt, a wardrobe, a dresser with a mirror, and even a small desk by the window. Lace curtains, yellowed with age, covered the glass. It was more luxury than Margaret had expected. "Mr. Brennan, this is too much. I'm just an employee. I can sleep in the bunkhouse or in a smaller room." "Absolutely not. You're a lady, Mrs. Hollies, and you'll be treated as such under my roof. Besides, the bunkhouse is no place for a woman, and the other bedroom is barely bigger than a closet. This is your room for as long as you're here." His tone brooked no argument. Margaret spent the rest of the day settling in and taking stock of the household. The kitchen was well supplied but disorganized. The sitting room hadn't been dusted in weeks. The men's clothing was mended haphazardly, if at all. She could see 100 things that needed attention, and for the first time in months, she felt a spark of purpose ignite in her chest. That evening, she cooked dinner for the 4 of them. A simple meal of fried chicken, potatoes, and greens from the small garden behind the house that had been neglected but was still producing. The men ate with the enthusiasm of people who had been surviving on their own cooking for far too long, and Charlie actually groaned with pleasure at the first bite. "Mrs. Hollies, if you can cook like this every day, I might just die a happy man," he said, his weathered face creasing in a smile. "Don't go dying on us, Charlie. We need you around to keep these cattle in line," Jacob said, but he was smiling too, and when his eyes met Margaret's across the table, she felt a flutter of something in her chest that she firmly told herself was just gratitude. The days fell into a rhythm. Margaret rose before dawn to cook breakfast for the men before they headed out to work on the ranch. She spent her mornings cleaning, mending, organizing, and slowly bringing order to the chaos of a household run by men alone. In the afternoons, she often rode out to check on the cattle or help with other ranch tasks. Despite her years away from active ranch work, she found the skills coming back quickly. Jacob was true to his word. He treated her with nothing but respect and courtesy. He never entered her room without knocking, never made inappropriate comments or gestures, and always made sure she felt safe and valued. He paid her a fair wage at the end of each week, and though she had nowhere to spend it, she carefully saved every penny. But more than the job security and the roof over her head, Margaret found herself appreciating Jacob's company. He was intelligent and well-read, with a dry sense of humor that often caught her off guard and made her laugh. In the evenings after dinner, they often sat on the porch and talked while the sun set and the desert cooled. They discussed books, politics, philosophy, and dreams. "What would you do if you could do anything?" Jacob asked her one evening, about 3 weeks after her arrival. Margaret considered the question seriously. "I think I'd like to have a place that's truly mine, not belonging to a husband or dependent on someone else's charity, just a piece of land that I owned outright where I could build something lasting. That's a good dream, Jacob said. Ownership gives a person dignity. I felt that way when I bought this ranch. For the first time in my life, I wasn't working someone else's land or building someone else's legacy. It was mine. What about you? If you could do anything, what would it be? Jacob was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening landscape. I'd like to not be alone anymore. Don't get me wrong, I appreciate Charlie and Miguel, but it's not the same as having a partner, someone to share the victories and the setbacks with. Someone to make plans with for the future. Sarah and I had that, and since she died, there's been this hollow space inside me that nothing seems to fill. The honesty of his words made Margaret's heart ache. She knew exactly what he meant because she felt the same emptiness. Despite her anger at Thomas, despite the practical nature of their marriage, she missed having someone to talk to at the end of the day. She missed being part of a team. I understand, she said softly. Jacob turned to look at her, and in the fading light, his eyes were dark and intense. I believe you do, Mrs. Hollis. Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of a connection that went deeper than employer and employee. Margaret felt it like a physical thing, a pull toward this man who had shown her kindness when she needed it most. But she also felt fear because allowing herself to feel anything for Jacob Brennan meant risking her heart again, and she wasn't sure she could survive another loss. She stood abruptly, smoothing her skirt. I should clean up the dinner dishes. I'll help you, Jacob said, rising as well. They worked side by side in the kitchen, washing and drying plates in comfortable silence. Margaret was acutely aware of Jacob's presence, the way his shoulder occasionally brushed hers, the sound of his breathing, the warmth radiating from his body in the small space. When he handed her a plate and their fingers touched, she felt a jolt of electricity that made her gasp. Sorry, Jacob said, though his eyes suggested he had felt it too. That night, Margaret lay in bed and forced herself to confront the truth. She was developing feelings for Jacob Brennan. Real feelings, not just gratitude or dependency. She was attracted to him, drawn to his kindness and strength and the way he made her feel valued and seen. But she was also terrified because she was 43 years old, a widow with nothing to offer, and he was her employer. Any romantic entanglement would be complicated at best and disastrous at worst. She resolved to maintain professional distance. But that resolution lasted exactly until the next morning when Jacob smiled at her over breakfast and asked if she wanted to ride out with him to check on the new calves. The joy in his eyes at her agreement made her heart skip a beat, and she knew she was fighting a losing battle. Over the following weeks, Margaret and Jacob grew closer despite her attempts at maintaining boundaries. They worked together during the days, their teamwork becoming almost seamless as they learned each other's rhythms and habits. In the evenings, they continued their porch conversations, delving deeper into each other's hopes, fears, and dreams. Jacob told her about his brothers back in Texas, about the falling out they had when he decided to move west, about his regret that he had let pride keep him from reaching out over the years. Margaret shared her childhood memories, both good and bad, and her secret dream of someday owning a bookstore, something that seemed impossibly frivolous given her circumstances. It's not frivolous, Jacob insisted. Books are important. They educate and inspire and transport us to other worlds. A good bookstore is a valuable thing for a community. It's just a silly dream, Margaret said, embarrassed. No dream is silly if it brings you joy to think about it, Jacob replied, and the way he looked at her made her feel like she was the only person in the world. The turning point came on a hot day in late July. Margaret had been at the ranch for nearly 2 months, and she had settled into her role so completely that it felt like she had always been there. She was in the garden, harvesting vegetables for dinner, when she heard shouting from the direction of the barn. She ran toward the sound and found Miguel on the ground, his leg bent at an unnatural angle, his face contorted in pain. Jacob and Charlie were crouched beside him, and Jacob's expression was grim. "What happened?" Margaret asked, dropping to her knees beside them. "His horse spooked at a rattlesnake and threw him. I think his leg is broken," Jacob said. Margaret immediately went into action, years of ranch life having taught her basic medical care. She sent Charlie to fetch blankets and water while she gently examined Miguel's leg, talking to him in a soothing voice to keep him calm. The break was bad but not compound, which meant the bone hadn't broken through the skin. "We need to set it and splint it before we move him," she said to Jacob. "Do you have any whiskey in the house? Get it and bring me 2 straight pieces of wood about this long." She indicated the length with her hands, and strips of cloth for binding. Jacob ran to comply while Margaret continued to comfort Miguel, who was crying and speaking rapidly in Spanish. She didn't understand all the words, but she caught enough to know he was worried about losing his job, about being unable to work, about being a burden. "You're not going to lose your job," she told him firmly. "Mr. Brennan is a good man, he'll take care of you. But you need to be brave right now because this is going to hurt." When Jacob returned with the supplies, Margaret gave Miguel several large swallows of whiskey, then nodded to Jacob and Charlie. "Hold him steady. Setting the bone was awful." Miguel screamed and then mercifully passed out from the pain. Margaret worked quickly, aligning the bone as best she could by feel, then securing the splints tightly with the cloth strips. By the time she finished, she was shaking and covered in sweat, but the leg was as straight as she could make it. "We need to get him to a doctor in town to make sure it's set properly," she said to Jacob, "but this should hold for the journey." They carefully loaded Miguel into the wagon, and Jacob drove him to Tucson while Charlie stayed behind to manage the ranch. Margaret rode along, sitting in the back of the wagon with Miguel's head in her lap, monitoring his condition and keeping him as comfortable as possible during the rough journey. The doctor in Tucson confirmed that Margaret had done an excellent job setting the leg. He gave Miguel laudanum for the pain and said he would need to stay off the leg for at least 6 weeks, longer if he wanted it to heal properly. The journey back to the ranch was quiet. Miguel was sleeping in the back and Margaret sat beside Jacob on the wagon seat. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. "You were amazing today," Jacob said, breaking the silence. "The way you took charge and knew exactly what to do, Miguel could have lost that leg if you hadn't acted so quickly." "I just did what needed to be done," Margaret replied. "Anyone would have done the same." "No, not anyone. You have a gift, Margaret, a strength and capability that's rare. I'm grateful every day that you came into my life." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it on his lips sent a shiver through her despite the heat. "Jacob," she said, testing his name as well. It felt right, natural. He turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw everything she was feeling reflected back at her. Want, hope, fear, and something deeper that made her breath catch. "Margaret, I know this is complicated. I know you're still grieving your husband and that you came here as an employee. But I need you to know that you've become so much more than that to me. You've brought life back to this ranch, back to my life. You've made me remember what it feels like to have something to look forward to when I wake up in the morning. Jacob, Margaret didn't know what to say. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "You don't have to say anything right now. I just wanted you to know how I feel. I'm 50 years old, Margaret, and I'm not a young man anymore. But when I'm with you, I feel like anything is possible. I feel happy." He reached over and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "We're never too old to be happy. You remember I told you that the day we met?" "I remember," Margaret whispered. "I meant it then, and I mean it now. I'm falling in love with you, Margaret Hollies. I know it's fast and probably foolish, but it's the truth. And I needed you to know, even if you don't feel the same way." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks. "I'm so scared, Jacob. I'm scared of feeling this way. I'm scared of losing everything again. I'm scared that I'm too old and too broken to deserve happiness." Jacob pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face her fully. He reached up and gently wiped away her tears with his thumb. "You're not too old. You're not broken, you're beautiful and strong and brave, and you deserve all the happiness in the world. I'm falling in love with you too, Margaret admitted, the words tumbling out in a rush. I didn't want to, I tried not to, but every day I'm with you I feel more alive. You make me laugh, you make me feel valued and seen. You make me believe that maybe I do have a future worth living. Jacob's smile was radiant. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But Margaret didn't want to pull away. She wanted this, wanted him, wanted the possibility of happiness that he represented. When his lips touched hers, it was gentle and sweet, a question and a promise all at once. They kissed there in the wagon as the sun set over the Arizona desert, and for the first time since Thomas's death, Margaret felt like she was home. The weeks that followed were a revelation. Jacob and Margaret continued to run the ranch together, but now there was an open acknowledgement of their feelings. They still maintained separate rooms out of respect for propriety, but they spent every possible moment together. They held hands while walking through the property. They stole kisses in the barn when Charlie and Miguel, now recuperating in the bunkhouse, weren't looking. They made plans for the future, tentative at first and then with growing confidence. I want to marry you, Jacob said one evening as they sat on the porch. I know we should wait a respectable amount of time given that you're still in mourning. But I'm 50 years old, Margaret, and I don't want to waste any more time. Life is too short and too uncertain. Margaret's heart sang, but she also felt a twinge of fear. What if people talk? What if they say terrible things about me, about us? Let them talk. I don't care what anyone thinks as long as you're by my side. Jacob took her hand. But if you want to wait, I'll wait. I'll wait as long as you need. I don't want to wait, Margaret said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. You're right. Life is too short. Thomas has been gone for almost 8 months now, and I've done my grieving. I'll always have a place for him in my memory, but I'm ready to move forward. I'm ready to be happy. They were married in September of 1882 in a small ceremony in Tucson. Charlie and Miguel stood up as witnesses, along with the doctor who had treated Miguel's leg and seemed delighted by the romantic outcome of that terrible day. Margaret wore a simple dress of sky blue, not the traditional white of a first-time bride, but something that felt appropriate for her second chance at love. When the justice of the peace pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob kissed her with such joy and tenderness that Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. These were happy tears, though so different from all the tears of grief and despair she had shed over the past year. The ranch became truly theirs, not just Jacob's with Margaret as a guest, but a partnership in every sense of the word. Margaret's name was added to the deed as co-owner, something Jacob insisted on despite her protests. We're partners in this life, he said firmly. That means you own half of everything, including this ranch. I never want you to feel vulnerable the way you did after Thomas died. This land is as much yours as it is mine. They worked side by side every day, building the ranch into something even more successful than it had been before. Margaret had a good head for figures, and she helped Jacob organize his accounts and create a system for tracking expenses and profits. They expanded the herd carefully, making sure they had the resources to support the growth. They hired 2 more ranch hands as the operation grew, good men who respected Margaret as much as they did Jacob. In the evenings, they would sit together in the sitting room, Margaret reading aloud from books while Jacob worked on mending tack or whittling. Sometimes they would play cards or checkers. Often they would simply talk, sharing thoughts and dreams and plans for the future. Their physical relationship was a revelation for Margaret. Thomas had been a perfunctory lover, viewing marital relations as a duty rather than a pleasure. But Jacob was attentive and passionate, taking time to learn what brought her joy, never rushing or making her feel like she was simply fulfilling an obligation. At 43, Margaret discovered pleasures she had never known existed, and she bloomed under Jacob's loving attention. One night, several months after their wedding, as they lay tangled together in the bed they now shared, Jacob traced patterns on her bare shoulder and said, I never thought I could be this happy again. You've given me a gift, Margaret. You've given me a reason to wake up excited about the day ahead. You've given me the same gift, Margaret replied, turning to kiss him. You took a woman who thought her life was over and showed her that it was just beginning. We're not too old for new adventures, are we? Jacob asked with a smile. We're never too old, Margaret agreed. The first year of their marriage passed in a blur of work and love and contentment. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Miguel's leg healed well, though he walked with a slight limp afterward. Charlie continued to be a steadfast presence, and Margaret came to think of both men as family. In the spring of 1883, Margaret missed her monthly courses. At first she dismissed it as a sign of her age. At 44, she assumed she was simply entering the change of life that all women faced. But when the nausea started, and her breasts became tender and her dresses began to feel tight around the middle, she couldn't deny the truth. She was pregnant. The realization filled her with a complex mixture of joy and terror. She had long ago accepted that she would never have children. Thomas had wanted them, but in 15 years of marriage she had never conceived. She had assumed the fault was with her body, that she was simply one of those women who couldn't bear children. But apparently, she had been wrong. Margaret waited until she was certain before telling Jacob. She chose an evening when they were alone on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Jacob, I need to tell you something. The seriousness in her tone made him turn to her with concern. What is it? Are you all right? I'm fine. More than fine, actually. I'm just not sure how you're going to react to this news. She took a deep breath. I'm pregnant. Jacob stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then his face broke into the widest smile Margaret had ever seen. He let out a whoop of joy that probably could be heard all the way to the bunkhouse and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests to be careful. Careful, careful. Margaret, this is the most amazing news I've ever heard. We're going to have a baby, a baby. He set her down gently, then immediately looked stricken. Unless you're not happy about it, I know we never discussed children. If you don't want this, I'll understand. Are you insane? Margaret laughed through happy tears. Of course I want this. I'm terrified because I'm 44 years old and this is my first pregnancy. I'm worried about all the things that could go wrong. But Jacob, I want this baby more than I've ever wanted anything. They held each other as the sun finished setting, both of them crying and laughing and marveling at the unexpected gift they had been given. The pregnancy was not easy. At her age, everything was more difficult and more dangerous. The doctor in Tucson was frank about the risks, warning them that complications were common in older mothers. He advised Margaret to rest as much as possible and to avoid any strenuous activity. Jacob became almost comically protective. He wouldn't let her lift anything heavier than a book. He insisted she rest every afternoon. He hired a woman from town to come help with the heavier housework. Margaret found his concern endearing but also occasionally frustrating. I'm pregnant, not made of glass, she told him one day when he wouldn't let her carry a small basket of vegetables from the garden. I know that. But you and this baby are the most precious things in the world to me, and I'm not taking any chances, Jacob replied stubbornly. As her belly grew, Margaret found herself filled with a sense of wonder. She would sit in the rocking chair Jacob had made for her and feel the baby move, tiny flutters at first and then stronger kicks and rolls. She would place Jacob's hand on her stomach so he could feel it too, and the look of awe on his face never failed to move her to tears. They talked about names and plans for the future. They converted the smallest bedroom into a nursery, painting it a cheerful yellow and filling it with a cradle that Charlie built and blankets that Margaret sewed. They argued good-naturedly about what they would teach their child, what values they wanted to instill, what kind of parents they wanted to be. I want our child to know that they're loved unconditionally, Margaret said. I want them to know that their worth isn't dependent on what they accomplish or how they look or who they marry. I want them to feel secure. I want our child to know that it's okay to fail, Jacob added. That mistakes are how we learn. I want them to be brave enough to take risks and chase their dreams. I want them to be kind, Margaret said, to see people who are hurting and help if they can. I want them to be happy, Jacob said simply, the way we're happy. The labor started on a cold night in December. Margaret woke to contractions that took her breath away, and Jacob immediately rode to town to fetch the doctor and the midwife. The labor lasted for 18 hours, grueling and exhausting. There were moments when Margaret was certain she was going to die, when the pain was so intense that she couldn't remember why she had thought having a baby was a good idea. But Jacob never left her side. He held her hand through every contraction, wiped her face with cool cloths, whispered encouragement and love into her ear. And when their son finally emerged into the world with a lusty cry when the midwife placed the squirming, red-faced infant on Margaret's chest, she felt a love so fierce and overwhelming that it took her breath away. "He's perfect," Jacob said, his voice choked with emotion. "Margaret, he's absolutely perfect." They named him Samuel Jacob Brennan, Samuel for Jacob's father and Jacob for his father. Little Sam, as they immediately began calling him, had a thick head of dark hair, blue eyes that would probably change color, and lungs that could wake the dead when he was hungry or wet, or simply wanted attention. Margaret had read that women sometimes didn't bond immediately with their babies, but from the moment she held Sam, she felt like her heart had been walking around outside her body. Every coo, every yawn, every tiny finger wrapped around hers was a miracle. She understood now why Jacob had been so protective during her pregnancy. She would do anything, literally anything, to keep this child safe. Jacob was a devoted father from the start. He changed diapers without complaint, walked the floor with Sam when he was fussy, and sang lullabies in a surprisingly pleasant baritone. He would stare at his son for hours, his face full of wonder. "I never thought I'd have this," he told Margaret one night as they watched Sam sleep in his cradle. "I had accepted that it wasn't going to be part of my life, and now here he is, this perfect little person who's half you and half me. It's a miracle, Margaret." "We're very blessed," Margaret agreed, leaning against her husband's solid warmth. The first months of Sam's life were exhausting but joyful. Margaret was constantly tired from the demands of caring for an infant, but she had never been happier. Jacob helped as much as he could while still managing the ranch, and Charlie and Miguel were both smitten with the baby, often stopping by the house just to hold him for a few minutes. As Sam grew, his personality emerged. He was a happy baby, quick to smile and laugh. He loved being outside, would stop crying immediately if taken out into the fresh air. He was fascinated by the horses and cattle, his eyes tracking their movements even when he was too young to understand what he was seeing. "He's going to be a rancher like his father," Margaret said fondly. "Or a bookstore owner like his mother wants to be," Jacob countered with a smile. When Sam was 6 months old, Jacob surprised Margaret with a small building in Tucson. It had once been a general store but had been empty for years. The previous owner had died and his heirs were eager to sell. "What is this?" Margaret asked as they stood in front of the dusty, neglected building. "It's your bookstore," Jacob said. "Or it will be if you want it. I know you said it was just a dream, but I want to help make your dreams come true the way you've made mine come true." Margaret stared at him, tears streaming down her face. "Jacob, this is too much. The expense, the work involved. It's not too much. We can afford it, Margaret. The ranch is doing well, and I know it will take time to get it up and running, but we have time. We're not too old to start new adventures, remember?" Over the next year, they worked on transforming the building into a bookstore. Jacob hired workers to do the heavy construction, fixing the roof and replacing damaged floorboards. Margaret designed the interior, creating cozy spaces for browsing and reading. She ordered books from catalogs, carefully choosing titles that she thought would appeal to the people of Tucson. It was slow going because Sam required so much attention, but Margaret didn't mind. She would bring him with her when she went to work on the store, setting up a basket where he could nap while she painted or organized shelves. Sometimes Jacob would come with them, doing repairs or building furniture while Margaret focused on the books. The bookstore opened in the spring of 1885 when Sam was almost 18 months old. Margaret named it the Desert Rose, after the flowers that bloomed in the harsh Arizona landscape. The opening day was better than she had dared hope. People came from all over town to browse the shelves, and Margaret sold 23 books on that first day. Running the bookstore in addition to the ranch and raising Sam was challenging, but Margaret thrived on it. She hired a young woman named Emma to help in the store several days a week, which allowed Margaret to split her time between Tucson and the ranch. Jacob was endlessly supportive, taking care of Sam when Margaret was in town and never complaining about the extra work. The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. Sam grew into a bright, curious toddler and then a sturdy little boy. He learned to walk on the ranch, his first steps taken in the dirt yard between the house and the barn. His first word was horse, which delighted Jacob to no end. He was a constant source of joy and occasional frustration, getting into everything with the fearless enthusiasm of early childhood. Margaret watched her son grow and marveled at how her life had changed. 7 years ago, she had been standing in the street in Tucson, believing her life was over. She had been convinced that at 43 she was too old to start fresh, too old to find happiness again. How wrong she had been. Now, at 50, Margaret had everything she had never known she wanted. A husband who loved her with a passion and devotion that never wavered. A son who filled her days with laughter and love. A ranch that was truly hers, not just by marriage but by right. A bookstore that was her pride and joy, a space she had created from nothing but her own dreams and hard work. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching Sam play with a wooden horse Jacob had carved for him, Margaret leaned her head on her husband's shoulder. "Do you remember what I said the day we met?" she asked. "You said a lot of things that day," Jacob replied with a smile. "But I remember the most important one. You said you were too old to start over again. And you said we're never too old to be happy." "I did, and I was right, wasn't I?" Margaret lifted her head to look at him, this man who had saved her when she was at her lowest point, who had seen her not as a burden or a charity case but as a partner and an equal, who had given her love and support and the space to grow into the person she was meant to be. "You were absolutely right, and I thank God every day that I met you, Jacob Brennan. You gave me a second chance at life when I thought there were no chances left." Jacob kissed her, soft and sweet. "You gave me the same thing, Margaret. You walked into my life and brought light and hope and joy. You and Sam are my whole world." They sat together as the sun set over the desert, watching their son play, their hands clasped together. The life they had built wasn't perfect. There were still hard days, setbacks, and challenges. The ranch required constant work and attention. The bookstore was a labor of love but not always profitable. Sam could be stubborn and difficult, as all children could be. They argued sometimes about money or decisions or how to handle various situations, but through it all, they had each other. They had built something real and lasting out of loss and despair. They had proven that it was never too late to start over, never too late to take a chance on happiness, never too late to fall in love. When Sam was 4 years old, Margaret discovered she was pregnant again. This time the surprise was even greater because at 51 she had been certain that ship had sailed. But apparently life had one more gift to give them. This pregnancy was more difficult than the first. Margaret's body was older, more tired, less resilient. She was on bed rest for the last 3 months, and there were several scares that had Jacob rushing her to the doctor in a panic. But when their daughter was born in the summer of 1887, healthy and squalling, Margaret felt the same overwhelming love she had felt when Sam was born. They named her Sarah Rose, Sarah for Jacob's first wife and Rose for the bookstore. Little Rose, as they called her, had reddish blonde hair and green eyes like her father. She was a quieter baby than Sam had been, more contemplative, watching the world with serious eyes. Sam was fascinated by his baby sister. He wanted to hold her constantly, to help with feeding and changing, to show her everything. He would bring her flowers and pretty rocks, placing them carefully in her cradle. Margaret watched her children together and felt her heart expand even more. "Two children at 51, she said to Jacob one night as they lay in bed, both of them exhausted from a day of chasing after Sam and caring for Rose. "When I was younger, I would have thought it impossible." "Impossible is just another word for something that hasn't happened yet," Jacob replied. "We're living proof of that." The years continued to roll by, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the milestones of their children's growth. Sam started school in Tucson, and Margaret would bring him to town on the days she worked at the bookstore. He was a bright student, reading far above his grade level thanks to growing up surrounded by books. Rose followed in her brother's footsteps, equally bright and curious. Charlie retired from active ranch work when his arthritis got too bad, but he stayed on the property in a small cabin Jacob built for him. He became an adopted grandfather to Sam and Rose, telling them stories and teaching them skills he had learned in his long life. Miguel eventually married a woman from town and started his own small ranch nearby, but he remained close friends with the Brennan family. The bookstore continued to thrive. It became a gathering place in Tucson, not just a place to buy books but a community center where people could meet and talk and share ideas. Margaret hosted reading groups and author visits when traveling writers came through town. She started a lending library for people who couldn't afford to buy books, funding it from her own pocket because she believed everyone deserved access to stories and knowledge. Jacob expanded the ranch, buying adjacent land when it became available. He was known throughout the territory as a fair and honest rancher, and his cattle were considered some of the best. He taught Sam everything he knew about ranching, and the boy took to it naturally, already talking about running the ranch himself someday. But even as they built their life and raised their children, Jacob and Margaret never forgot where they had come from. They never forgot the despair and hopelessness that had brought them together. They made a point of helping others who were struggling, whether it was offering jobs to people down on their luck or helping widows and widowers find their footing after loss. One day, a woman came into the Desert Rose. She was around 45, dressed in shabby clothes with lines of worry etched into her face. She browsed the shelves but didn't buy anything, and Margaret noticed her wiping tears from her eyes. Margaret approached her gently. "Can I help you find something?" "I'm sorry," the woman said, her voice breaking. "I shouldn't be here. I can't afford to buy anything. My husband died last year and I lost our farm. I'm barely scraping by and I shouldn't be wasting time looking at books." The words were so familiar, so painfully reminiscent of Margaret's own situation years ago that she felt tears spring to her own eyes. "What's your name?" "Eliza. Eliza Cooper." "Well, Eliza, I'm Margaret Brennan and I own this bookstore and I want to tell you something. 11 years ago, I was exactly where you are now. I had just lost my husband and my home. I had nothing and no one, and I thought my life was over. I was standing on a street in this very town, telling myself I was too old to start over again." Eliza looked up, her eyes full of surprise and hope. "What happened?" "I met someone who told me that we're never too old to be happy. He gave me a chance when I needed it most, and that changed everything. Now I have a life I never could have imagined, and I'm going to offer you the same chance I was given." Margaret took Eliza's hand. "I need help in this bookstore. Someone to work here a few days a week, help customers, organize inventory, keep the place running when I'm at the ranch. The pay is fair, and I can offer you room and board at my ranch until you get on your feet. What do you say?" Eliza stared at her, tears streaming down her face. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" "Because someone did it for me, and because you're not too old to start over. You're not too old to be happy, you just need someone to give you a chance." Eliza accepted the offer, and true to Margaret's word, she thrived. Within a year, she had saved enough money to rent her own place. Within 2 years, she had met a widower who worked at the bank, and they married. They remained close friends with the Brennan family, and Eliza often said that Margaret had saved her life. But Margaret always replied the same way. "I didn't save you. I just reminded you that you were worth saving. You did the rest yourself." As Sam and Rose grew older, they became more independent. Sam at 12 was already helping run the ranch, working alongside his father and the ranch hands. Rose at 8 was a bookworm, spending every free moment reading and helping her mother at the bookstore. They were good children, kind and thoughtful, and Jacob and Margaret were immensely proud of them. One evening, when Sam was 14 and Rose was 10, the family sat around the dinner table. Sam was talking excitedly about a new breeding program he wanted to try with the cattle, while Rose was describing a book she had just finished. Margaret looked around the table at her family, at Jacob, who was listening to Sam with pride in his eyes, at her children who were so full of life and possibility, and she felt overcome with gratitude. After dinner, when the children had gone to bed, Margaret and Jacob took their usual place on the porch. It was a ritual they had maintained for 15 years now, this time together at the end of the day. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Margaret asked. "If we hadn't met that day in town, if you hadn't said what you said." "I think about it sometimes," Jacob admitted. "And it terrifies me. I almost didn't stop and talk to you, you know. I saw you standing there and something told me to walk by, that it wasn't my business. But then you spoke and I heard the pain in your voice and I couldn't just leave you there." "I'm so glad you didn't. You saved my life, Jacob." "We saved each other," Jacob corrected. "I was barely living before you came along. I was existing, going through the motions, but not truly living. You brought me back to life, Margaret." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the desert night. Finally, Jacob spoke again. "I'm 65 years old now. I've been thinking about the future, about what happens when I'm gone. I want to make sure you and the children are taken care of." "Don't talk like that," Margaret said, fear clutching at her heart. "You're healthy and strong. We have years ahead of us still." "I hope so. God, I hope so, but we need to be practical. I've been working with a lawyer in town to make sure everything is in order. The ranch is jointly owned by both of us, and if something happens to me, it goes entirely to you. Same with my share of the bookstore profits. I want you to be secure, the way you weren't before." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. Even after all these years, Jacob was still thinking about her welfare, still making sure she would be protected. "Thank you, but please don't leave me. I can't imagine my life without you in it." "I'm not planning on going anywhere," Jacob said, pulling her close. "I plan to stick around and see Sam run this ranch and Rose open her own bookstore chain and become grandparents together. I plan to grow old with you, Margaret Brennan, because you're the best thing that ever happened to me." They made love that night with the passion and tenderness that had never faded from their relationship. At 58 and 65, they were no longer young, but their desire for each other remained strong. Afterward, lying wrapped in each other's arms, Margaret felt profoundly grateful for every moment they had together. The years continued to pass. Sam grew into a fine young man, tall and strong like his father, with his mother's intelligence and compassion. He started courting a rancher's daughter named Anna, and when he was 21, they married in a beautiful ceremony at the ranch. Anna was a wonderful addition to the family, and she and Margaret became close friends. Rose, true to everyone's predictions, was passionate about books and learning. She went to a teacher's college in California, one of the first women from Tucson to pursue higher education. When she returned home, she became a teacher at the local school, inspiring young minds just as her mother had inspired her. Jacob and Margaret became grandparents when Sam and Anna had their first child, a boy they named Jacob after his grandfather. Margaret held her grandson and marveled at the continuity of life, at how love and family extended across generations. "From nothing to all of this," she said to Jacob as they watched Sam play with his son. "How did we get so lucky?" "It wasn't luck," Jacob said. It was courage. You were brave enough to take a chance on a stranger's offer. You were brave enough to believe that you deserved happiness. That kind of bravery makes its own luck. When Margaret was 62 and Jacob was 69, his health began to decline. It started with small things, forgetting words or losing track of time. Then came the chest pains and the shortness of breath. The doctor diagnosed a weak heart and said there wasn't much that could be done except rest and medication. Margaret was terrified of losing him, but Jacob faced his mortality with the same calm acceptance he brought to everything. "I've had a wonderful life, Margaret. I've loved and been loved. I've raised children and built something lasting. I've watched the sunrise with you more times than I can count. If it's my time, then I'm at peace with that." "But I'm not," Margaret said fiercely. "I need more time with you. We're supposed to grow old together. We are growing old together. We have grown old together. Look at us, we're ancient." Jacob smiled, but there was sadness in his eyes. "I know you're scared, I'm scared too, but whatever time we have left, let's make it count. Let's not waste a single moment." So they didn't. They spent every day together, sometimes working on the ranch, sometimes sitting at the bookstore, sometimes simply lying in bed and talking. They told each other their favorite memories, reminisced about the early days of their relationship, talked about their children and grandchildren. They said all the things that needed to be said, left nothing unspoken. Jacob lived for 2 more years after his diagnosis. They were good years, filled with love and laughter despite the shadow of his illness. He was there when Rose married a lawyer from Tucson, a kind man named David who loved books as much as she did. He was there when Sam and Anna had their second child, a daughter named Margaret after her grandmother. He was there for birthdays and holidays and all the small, ordinary moments that made up a life. On a warm evening in June of 1900, Jacob died peacefully in his sleep with Margaret beside him. She woke to find him gone, his face serene, his hand still clasped in hers. The grief was overwhelming, a physical pain that made it hard to breathe. But underneath the grief was gratitude. Gratitude for the 18 years they had together, for the love they had shared, for the family they had built. The funeral was attended by half of Tucson. Jacob had been respected and loved by everyone who knew him, and people came from all over to pay their respects. Margaret stood between Sam and Rose, drawing strength from her children, and listened as person after person told stories about Jacob's kindness, his generosity, his wisdom. After the funeral, as the crowd dispersed, Margaret stood alone at Jacob's grave. Charlie, now ancient but still alive, came to stand beside her. "He was a good man," Charlie said simply. "The best man," Margaret agreed. "He told me once that you saved his life. Said he was just going through the motions before you came along, but you gave him a reason to live again." Margaret smiled through her tears. "He said the same thing about me. We saved each other." "That's what real love does," Charlie said. "It saves us. It makes us better than we were alone." Margaret thought about that as she walked back to the ranch house, which felt empty without Jacob's presence. She thought about the woman she had been 18 years ago, standing on a street in Tucson, convinced her life was over. She thought about the man who had stopped and spoken words that changed everything. "We're never too old to be happy." He had been right. They had found happiness together, built a life that was rich and full. They had proven that age was just a number, that it was never too late to take chances, to fall in love, to start over. And even though Jacob was gone, the life they had built remained. The ranch thrived under Sam's management. The bookstore continued to be a cornerstone of the community. Rose was educating a new generation of children. Their grandchildren were growing up strong and healthy. Jacob's legacy lived on in all of it. Margaret lived for another 15 years after Jacob's death. She continued to run the bookstore, though she gradually turned more and more responsibility over to Rose. She spent time with her grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather and the Wild West days. She helped Sam with the ranch when he needed her, though her body was no longer up to the physical labor she had once done so easily. On her 77th birthday, surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, Margaret looked around at the life she had built and felt overwhelming gratitude. She had been blessed beyond measure. She had known great love twice in her life. She had raised children who were kind and successful. She had built businesses and contributed to her community. She had lived. That night, alone in the bedroom she had once shared with Jacob, Margaret looked at the photograph on her bedside table. It showed her and Jacob on their wedding day, both of them smiling radiantly. She traced Jacob's face with her finger and whispered, "Thank you. Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. Thank you for believing in me when I had stopped believing in myself. Thank you for showing me that we're never too old to be happy." Margaret died peacefully in her sleep a few months later, in the spring of 1915. She was buried beside Jacob, their graves side by side overlooking the ranch they had built together. The headstones were simple, bearing their names, dates, and a single inscription that Rose had chosen: "We're never too old to be happy." The story of Margaret and Jacob became a legend in Tucson, passed down through generations. People told it to comfort those who were grieving, to inspire those who felt lost, to remind everyone that it was never too late to start over. The ranch continued to be run by their descendants, and the bookstore remained in operation for another 50 years before finally closing. But the message at the heart of their story, the truth they had proven with their lives, endured. Love could come at any age. Happiness could be found even in the darkest moments. Second chances were possible if you were brave enough to take them. And it was never, ever too late to build a life worth living. Sam, in his old age, would tell his grandchildren about his parents' great love story. He would describe how they met, how his father had seen something special in his mother when she couldn't see it in herself, how they had built an empire from nothing but love and hard work. "The most important thing they taught me," Sam would say, "was that life isn't over until you decide it's over. My mother thought she was done at 43. My father was 50 and alone, but they chose to believe in the possibility of happiness, and that belief transformed both their lives." That's the legacy they left us, the belief that we're never too old, never too broken, never too lost to find our way home. And in the town of Tucson, Arizona, for generations after, when someone felt like giving up, when someone felt too old or too tired or too defeated to go on, there was always someone who would tell them the story of Margaret and Jacob, who would remind them that long ago, a weary widow and a lonely cowboy met on a dusty street and proved that the human capacity for hope and love and happiness knows no age limit. They proved that we're never too old to start over again. We're never too old to take chances. We're never too old to fall in love. We're never too old to be happy. And that truth, simple but profound, lived on long after they were gone, inspiring countless others to believe in second chances and the possibility of joy, no matter how impossible it might seem. The Desert Rose bookstore, though it eventually closed, was remembered fondly by everyone who had ever walked through its doors. It had been more than just a place to buy books. It had been a sanctuary, a community hub, a place where dreams were nurtured and hope was restored. Margaret had built it from nothing, proof that reinvention was possible at any age. Rose eventually wrote a book about her parents, a small volume that was published locally. It told their story in full, from their meeting to Jacob's death to Margaret's peaceful final years. The book became a beloved item in Tucson, passed from parent to child, read at weddings and funerals, a reminder of what true love looked like. In the book's introduction, Rose wrote, "My parents' greatest gift to me was not the ranch or the bookstore or the financial security they worked so hard to provide. Their greatest gift was showing me that life is full of chapters, and just because one chapter ends doesn't mean the story is over. They taught me to be brave, to take chances, to believe in the possibility of happiness even when everything seems dark. They taught me that we're never too old to become who we're meant to be." The ranch itself remained in the family for 5 generations. Each generation added to it, improved it, honored the foundation that Jacob and Margaret had laid. A small museum was eventually created on the property, showcasing artifacts from the early days. Visitors could see the rocking chair Jacob had made for Margaret when she was pregnant with Sam, the quilt Sarah had made that covered their wedding bed, photographs and letters and bits of everyday life that told the story of two people who had found each other against all odds. Anna, Sam's wife, lived to be 97 years old. In her final interview before her death, she was asked what she remembered most about her in-laws. She thought for a long moment before answering. "I remember the way they looked at each other," she said. Even after years of marriage, even when they were old and gray, they would look at each other like they were the most amazing thing they had ever seen. I remember Jacob touching Margaret's hand as they passed each other, just a brief moment of connection. I remember Margaret's face lighting up when Jacob came into a room. They loved each other so deeply, so completely, that it transformed everyone around them. Being in their presence made you believe in love, in the goodness of the world, in the possibility of happiness. That's what I remember most. Not any specific story or event, but the feeling of being around two people who had found their perfect match. The legacy of Margaret and Jacob extended beyond their immediate family. The people they had helped over the years, people like Eliza Cooper and Miguel and countless others who had been given second chances, went on to help others in turn. A ripple effect of kindness and compassion that spread outward, touching lives they would never know about. In Tucson, a scholarship was eventually established in their names, designed to help older students who wanted to go back to school or learn new skills. The scholarship committee received hundreds of applications every year from people who, like Margaret, had thought their time for growth and change had passed. Many of the recipients went on to do amazing things, starting businesses, changing careers, finding new purpose and meaning in their lives. One recipient, a 55-year-old woman named Patricia who had been widowed and lost her home, used the scholarship to become a nurse. She wrote a letter to the scholarship committee that was framed and hung in the Tucson City Hall. "When I applied for this scholarship, I felt like my life was over. I felt too old, too tired, too broken to start again. But reading about Margaret and Jacob Brennan gave me hope. If a 43-year-old widow could start over in 1882, surely I could do the same in 1965. This scholarship didn't just give me an education. It gave me back my belief in myself and in the possibility of a better future. I will spend the rest of my life trying to pay forward the gift that Margaret and Jacob gave me." Stories like Patricia's were common. The scholarship helped hundreds of people over the decades, each one another testament to the truth that Jacob had spoken that day on the street. "We're never too old to be happy." As the 20th century progressed and Tucson grew from a small frontier town into a modern city, the story of Margaret and Jacob could have been forgotten, lost to time like so many others. But it endured because it spoke to something universal in the human experience. The fear of being too old, too late, too lost. The hope that second chances are possible. The belief that love can heal and transform and make us new in the end. Perhaps that was the greatest legacy of Margaret and Jacob Brennan. Not the ranch or the bookstore or the children and grandchildren who carried on their work. Their greatest legacy was the simple but powerful message that no one is ever too old to start over, to find love, to be happy. That message, born from their meeting on a dusty street in Tucson in 1882, continued to inspire and comfort people more than a century later. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Margaret and Jacob were together again. Walking hand in hand through endless sunsets, free from pain and grief and the burdens of mortality. Happy, at peace, and still very much in love. Still proving, even in death, that the bonds we forge in life are stronger than any ending, that love endures, that hope matters. That we're never too old to be happy. Their story was complete, the circle closed. from loss to love, from despair to hope, from endings to new beginnings. It was a story that belonged not just to them, but to everyone who had ever felt lost and found their way home. To everyone who had ever thought it was too late and discovered it wasn't. To everyone who had ever taken a chance on love and found it was worth the risk. The desert still stretched out beyond the ranch, vast and beautiful and harsh. The sun still set in brilliant colors over the Arizona landscape. And on their graves, the inscription still proclaimed their truth to anyone who cared to read it. We're never too old to be happy. It was a promise. A declaration. A truth proven by 2 lives lived fully and well. And it would endure as long as there were people who needed to hear it, who needed to believe it, who needed to be reminded that hope and love and happiness are possible at any age, in any circumstances, if we're brave enough to reach for them. That was the story of Margaret and Jacob Brennan. A love story, a redemption story, a story of second chances and the courage to believe in them, a story that began with despair and ended with joy, a story that proved once and for all that we're never too old to start over again. We're never too old to be happy. And they lived happily ever after in life and in memory forever.